I was at a grocery store checkout line and I could hear the beep of the scanners. And you have that low level impatience at the end of the day. Most of us carry that because we're tired and we're just trying to get home. I was standing there, half present, thinking about nothing in particular, when something happened that I haven't been able to shake. A mother and her adult daughter were checking out beside me. And for context, the mother was much older. Now, the daughter said to her mom, "You're getting in my way. Stop it." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was sharp. And then she added, "Stop touching things. This is expensive." Now, what did the mom do? She didn't argue, she didn't push back. She also didn't seem confused or disruptive in any way. She just walked back to the side of the grocery cart and just sort of shrank. And in that moment, something in me cracked wide open because what I saw wasn't conflict, it wasn't stress, it wasn't even anger, it was humiliation. And speaking of this, on today's episode, I want to talk about that because here's the thing. Most of us think we know what older abuse looks like in our seniors. We probably picture something obvious. I mean, I did until that moment, something that's extreme, something that happens behind closed doors, or maybe makes the evening news. So we're talking about bruises, neglect, financial exploitation. There are clear villains in that scenario. Those are the kind of stories that feel safely separate from everyday life. But here's what rarely gets talked about. According to the national and global estimates, about 1 in 10 older adults experiences some form of abuse every year. And researchers believe that number is actually much higher because most cases are never reported. Some estimates suggest only 1 out of every 24 cases ever even comes to the attention of authorities. That means that the majority of older adults, the abuse that happens to them doesn't show up in statistics, headlines, or even court cases. It shows up in moments that look normal, like a grocery store checkout line. Because when we hear the word abuse, most of us imagine violence. But what the data and lived experience tells us is that the most common form of elder abuse, is emotional and psychological. So that means it's not physical, it's not visible, it's not dramatic. And that's why what I witnessed mattered so much because it didn't fit the picture we've been taught to recognize. And yet I knew in my body that something harmful had just happened. Not because there was shouting, not because there was chaos, but because of the tone, the sharpness, that public correction, the way the mother's presence was framed as a problem. Elder abuse doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like irritation, dismissal, impatience disguised as efficiency, a sharp tone used to manage rather than to communicate, being made to feel like you're in the way. And because these moments don't leave the bruises that we talked about earlier, we often will tell ourselves that they don't really count. And so we could say things like that. The caregiver is just stressed. They didn't really mean it that way. It's not abuse, it's just frustration. But here's what the research and human experience make clear: impact matters more than intent. So emotional harm doesn't need to be loud to be real. It doesn't need to be witnessed to take root. And it doesn't need repetition over years to land in ways that are harmful. Sometimes one moment of public humiliation is enough to change how someone sees themselves. That's why this stayed with me, because what I saw wasn't an isolated interaction. It really was a micro example of something happening millions of times a day, quietly, casually, and often in plain sight. And when harm becomes normalized, it becomes invisible. That's how it continues. And I want to be very clear about something before we go any further, because I know that there are those of you out there that are hearing right now about the stress that caregivers have, especially if they're caring for their older parents. This is not about blaming caregivers. It isn't about pointing fingers at adult children, and it isn't about pretending that caring for aging parents is easy, because it's not. Aging changes relationships. It will shift roles. It introduces fear, grief, stress, and exhaustion, and usually all at one time. Most harm doesn't come from outright cruelty, it comes from overwhelm. And yet, even when harm isn't intentional, it still lands in a very harmful, hurtful way. So instead of asking, who's wrong here? I want to ask a quieter question. What happens inside a person when moments like this repeat over time? Because that's where the real damage lives. So when I talk about that mother shrinking, I want to explain what I mean, because this isn't just poetic language, it's psychological. Research on aging and emotional well being consistently shows that senior adults, older adults, are especially sensitive to social cues related to respect, autonomy, and inclusion. Not because they're fragile, but because so much of their independence has already been challenged. So think about this. As you're aging, you lose speed. Your body also doesn't want to cooperate with you all the time the way that it used to. And there are things that you have to ask for help with that you used to do by yourself. So your sense of self is already under a quiet strain. So, when a senior adult, an older adult is spoken to then with irritation, especially in a public arena, they're not just embarrassed or don't feel that stinging of those words. It's actually reinforcing a message that they're already trying to fight each and every day. I am becoming a burden. This really describes, from a psychological perspective, an internalized ageism. That's the term that they use for it. When senior adults begin to absorb society's negative messages about aging, and society does have negative messages about aging, and then they turn that inward. And here's what's important: that internalization doesn't usually come from one big traumatic event. It comes from small, repeated moments. What do those moments look like? Have you ever been behind a senior adult or an older adult? Maybe you're going into a store. I have several times. They're going very slow and you're kind of stuck behind them. Have you noticed what people usually do? Not everybody, but a lot of people will sigh because they're taking too long. That is a repeated moment. The sharp correction maybe that happens when they reach for the wrong thing. I've seen that in the store as well. The way that conversations start happening around them instead of with them. And I talked about that in a previous episode about what it's like to be a woman in your 60s. And over time, but it's not, just so you know, that doesn't just happen to women in their 60s. I'm talking about senior adults. And over time, many senior adults, older adults respond not with resistance, but with this form of withdrawal, the same kind that I saw in the mom at the checkout line. They begin to speak less. They will offer less help. They will stop asserting preferences. They'll just accept whatever. And they stop correcting misunderstandings. But you need to know something. It's not because they don't care or that's just what happens when you get older, but it's because they're trying to avoid being a problem. Studies on emotional abuse in senior adults show that this kind of treatment is usually associated with then increased depression and anxiety, lower self esteem, greater social isolation, and even faster cognitive and physical decline. So it's impacting their health. And I have talked about the loneliness epidemic in seniors in several different episodes. So they're withdrawing. And it's not because the words are powerful in some sort of abstract way. I mean, words do have power sometimes, but here we're talking about belonging being a biological need. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, when you have this type of thing happening repeatedly, when dignity is threatened, the nervous system begins to notice. So that's what I mean about biological need. And here's where I want to slow this down even more. Most adult children aren't trying to erase their parents. So, again, I don't want you thinking that this isn't about the caregiver. I'm not attacking the caregiver per se. Most adult children are trying to just get through the day. They're juggling work, care, finances, kids, health responsibilities, and they're really just kind of scared of what's coming next. But that fear that they're feeling often shows up as control. So it's kind of the experience I had at that grocery store. It was more like mom was getting in the way and she was just trying to get through the checkout. And control, when you layer it over love, can still feel like rejection on the receiving end. That's what makes this so complicated and so human. What I saw in that grocery store, I don't think it was malice. It was a collision between stress and vulnerability. And the person with less power, in this case, mom, is also the one with fewer options. And they are also the one that absorbs the impact. And they do it usually quietly. And this is usually the moment where people say, well, yeah, you saw that, but you don't know their story. And they're right. I don't. I don't know what that daughter has lived through. I don't know how long she's been caregiving. I don't know if she's exhausted, grieving, financially strained, or scared about what's coming next. Caregiving, especially for aging parents, is one of the most emotionally complex roles a person can step into. Research has consistently demonstrated that family caregivers experience significantly higher rates of chronic stress, anxiety, and depression than the general population. Many are caring for parents while also raising kids, working full time, and managing their own health. And you might have heard this particular station in life, this stage where you're at, referred to as the sandwich generation, or okay, I'll say generation, this generation in your life, but it's more or less a stage that happens. But anyway, most often you'll hear people refer to it as a sandwich generation. And when people are overwhelmed, their nervous system shifts into survival mode. So if you're in that sandwich generation, which means that you're caring for parents, aging parents, while also raising kids, working full time, and managing your own health, your patience might shorten and your tolerance might become really thin. And control starts to feel like the only way that you can keep things from unraveling in your life. So it makes sense, humanely, how moments like the one I witnessed happen. But here's where we need to be careful, because understanding why something happens is not the same as dismissing what it does. What I am saying here is there is a difference between intent and impact. Most emotional harm is not intentional, but the body doesn't register intent. It registers tone, posture, public correction, the loss of agency or control. From the older adult's perspective, what lands isn't my daughter is stressed. What lands is I am a problem. And over time, that message accumulates. And I'm going to tell you that research is consistent on these findings. There have been tons of studies done on senior emotional abuse, older emotional abuse, and it demonstrates and shows that even when caregivers report love and good intentions, seniors are still experiencing increased feelings of worthlessness, heightened anxiety in public spaces, reluctance to ask for help, and take that back to when I talk about, homelessness and how our seniors end up on the street because they're reluctant to ask for help. That's one aspect, but also a growing sense of invisibility. Not because anyone is trying to harm them, but because power has shifted and the emotional weight flows in one direction. This is what makes family based senior abuse so hard to talk about because there really are no villains, just people at different points of vulnerability. One struggling to hold things together, the other struggling to hold on to dignity. And without awareness, stress quietly becomes justification because we tell ourselves sometimes people tell themselves they're lucky to have help. Maybe you have a strained relationship with your adult as an adult and your parents based on some childhood trauma. Maybe you tell yourself I'm doing the best I can, or that they don't understand how hard it is. And all of that can be true, and still harm can occur. So what really matters isn't perfection, it's awareness. Because when we see the moment clearly without shame, then we're able to gain the ability to pause. And pause is where everything begins to change. And this is the point where I think we need to zoom out a little bit because what I witnessed in the grocery store wasn't just about one daughter and one mother. It was about the world that we're standing in today. We live in a culture that quietly teaches us what and who matters. We generally reward speed, efficiency, productivity, output. From the time that we're young, we learn that moving fast is good, that being useful is valuable, that slowing things down is a problem to be fixed. And aging, by its very nature, slows the system. So, without ever saying it out loud, our society begins, maybe it's even a culture, our society that we live in begins to treat older adults as friction. What do I mean? Well, it's they become something to manage, something to work around, something that disrupts the flow. You can see it in everyday places, in checkout lines that move too quickly, in medical appointments scheduled in 10-minute blocks, in public spaces designed without rest, patience, or accessibility in mind, and in families where stress is already high, especially if you're a caregiver. Those cultural values don't disappear. Societal values really in this case don't disappear. They come home with us. So when our older parent seniors, when they're moving slowly, when they forget things, when perhaps they reach for the wrong item or ask one too many questions, it isn't just inconvenient at this point. It's colliding with a system that tells us time is money and delay is failure. There have been a lot of studies done on ageism, and they are consistently finding that these negative societal attitudes toward aging are linked to poor physical and mental health outcomes in seniors and older adults. Not because, though, words magically cause illness. I need to be clear with that. But because being treated as irrelevant or burdensome changes how people engage with the world around them. So, what you begin to see, which is directly correlated to many different episodes that I've done, different topic, homelessness, loneliness, depression, anxiety, people withdraw. They ask for less help. They're going to take fewer societal risk. They're going to internalize the belief that they are in the way. They already are feeling less control in their life. And then that internalization doesn't stay emotional. It affects mobility, it affects cognition, longevity. There was a large body of research that was done that has even shown that senior adults, older adults who hold more positive views of aging, they actually live significantly longer than those who are absorbing negative societal messages about growing older. So when we rush a senior, when we speak to them as obstacles, when we correct them publicly in the name of efficiency, we aren't just managing that moment that we feel we need control of. We are actually reinforcing a worldview about aging in society. A worldview that's basically saying worth is conditional. That if you can't keep up, you should stay quiet. You shouldn't be seen. And the thing is, most of us don't consciously believe this. We don't wake up thinking, I value speed more than dignity, but we've been trained into it. And when stress rises, training takes over. That's why moments like the one I witnessed feel so common and yet so invisible. They fit the rhythm of a world that has forgotten how to move slowly with one another. I mean, you see it everywhere. Even here on this podcast, you got to come in and get to the point right away. Most people don't want to take the time to listen. And this is the part that's hardest to talk about because when we imagine harm, we want distance from it. Most people do. We want it to come from strangers. If it has to happen at all. I mean, I would say I don't want it to come at all, but if it does, hey, come from strangers, not family. Maybe from institutions even, from places we can clearly label as unsafe. But the truth is, most senior mistreatment happens within families. It's not because families are cruel necessarily, but because they're close. There is history there, there is love, there's obligation. And because familiarity can slowly turn into entitlement, what do I mean by that? Well, listen, entitlement feels like you can correct, you can rush, you can speak to seniors, your aging parents, your grandparents, etc., in ways we would never speak to anyone else. It happens. You don't have to be a senior to understand that in a family. But we excuse it by saying they know I don't mean it. They know I love them. We've always talked like this. I'm the one doing everything. And again, those feelings are real. Caregiving, though, is heavy. It's emotionally draining. It brings up grief long before it actually happens. So we have to recognize that. I didn't speak that day. Every part of me wanted to. I wanted to say something gentle, something grounding, but I froze. And it wasn't because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure what the right thing was. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I didn't want to escalate the moment. I didn't want to make assumptions about a relationship I knew nothing about. So I did what many of us do. I stayed quiet. And then I went home and I cried instead. That silence has stayed with me, not as a shame, but as a question. Because when moments like this happen in public spaces, they don't just involve the people directly interacting, they involve all of us who witness it. I didn't speak in that grocery store that day, and I still wish that I had, but I can speak now. And maybe that's how change actually can begin, not with confrontation, but with attention. Slow down long enough to notice when someone else is shrinking in front of us. Let's choose kindness when stress gives us every excuse not to. What I've learned since then is this: Intervention doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means presence. And if you're still with me, thank you for spending this time to have this really tough conversation because dignity, like harm, often lives in the smallest moments. And until next episode, take care of your mind, body, and soul.